I'm always thinking about quantum physics is essentially unknowable. There's models, mathematical models that approach the unknown, but what is it really? What is happening? We haven't got access to the real, or I call it the unreal. We don't know.
Welcome to the Culture and Technology Podcast, brought to you by the Vienna Business Agency. My name is Severin Matusek, and today's guest is Libby Heaney. Libby is an artist and scientist using quantum physics as an artistic medium. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi.
Hi. So I want to start with a post I recently saw from you on your Instagram where you mentioned it is a common misconception about you that you make art about science. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I think this is a really good place to start. Thank you for bringing that up. Because I'm using, and I'll unpack what this is, or we can unpack it together, but I'm using quantum materiality. So as a medium, so you know, like how Monet or Cézanne, they weren't making paintings about pain. They were looking at the world and expressing different things. But they use paint as their medium. I'm using quantum particles as my medium, but I'm looking at other things. So my works are psychological, they're dealing with emotion, they're dealing with what it means to be human in a degraded environment, or I'm trying to think of different works here. So some older ones are a bit more about quantum physics or quantum technologies, but still open out into a much wider discussion. But mostly my most recent works deal with psychology and the environment, I would say.
I read in an interview you expressed it as you using quantum as a prism, into as a portal almost to explore different realities, different ways of thinking. I mean, maybe to start with, we have to get into what is quantum anyway, and then take it from there.
What is a prism? Yeah. Just to go back. So I use it as a medium and a lens through which to reimagine the world. So it's like a metaphor and a medium. But yeah, what is quantum? What do you think quantum is?
That's a great question. So I did my research, of course. So quantum, in my amateur words, it's a scientific theory that I think, as you mentioned in one interview, has not really been falsified so far. So it's one of the most solid theories we have about the world. And quantum is currently a very hyped up field in terms of computing, where there are existing quantum, very basic computers, I think by IBM, that you can access via the cloud. But when it comes to quantum computing, the promise is that quantum computing basically intensifies the computing power of the binary computer by 1 trillion times or something like that, and goes beyond the binary distinction of the way computing has been structured over the last 100 years or so. So it promises many advantages, but it's not there yet, the future. So major tech companies, major governments are working on it, because obviously once it's there, it's gonna open up many new opportunities. But I think I understand your work as, coming from the scientific background, as someone who has worked on that as a scientist for, I think, more than 10 years. You use the science and the theory as a gateway to expressing other things through your art. So can you falsify or verify my theory?
I think you were excellent. It's really interesting to ask you, because I guess anyone listening to this or watching this will have hopefully interest in it, but maybe a understanding that they might be a lot of, I guess what I'm trying to say is when people come up to me and they always start by going, I don't know much about quantum, but people do know a bit about it. So it's always interesting to understand where people are at and what they're thinking. So thank you for sharing that.
So how would you expand on my definition?
Well, yeah, I mean, it is a theory of reality, a physical theory, that has never been falsified. So it is super solid in terms of the models that we have of reality appear to be true as far as we can say true. There's never been a way of, falsifying them. But what those models describe, we didn't really touch on. You didn't bring up, and this is what I'm particularly interested in. So quantum physics describes the microscopic world, atoms and photons and some molecules, some subatomic particles, under certain conditions, so not always. And at that level, particularly when things get very, very cold, like the coldest temperatures in the universe, minus 273 degrees, things get very weird and very counterintuitive. So quantum physics describes that weirdness. You know, in just over 100 years ago, scientists thought they'd solved reality. They could predict everything using Newtonian physics, which is the physics of macroscopic world. And then they started to notice anomalies and things weren't quite right at that microscopic level, and that led to the development of quantum. So I suppose, how is it weird is another question. What, do you have anything to say before I go into I could talk all day on these things.
I mean, I think I'm curious about how you translate something that's happening in extremely complicated physical science rooms when it comes to microscopic elements that you described. How does that translate into visual representation and art making?
Yeah, so I use, actually IBM about 2 months ago have just changed all their permissions on their quantum computers, so you can't use them anymore. But the point is that, so quantum computers are like a portal or a way of accessing these atoms or molecules that are doing strange things. So at the quantum level is non-binary. That means like particles can be doing two contradictory things at once. So they could be, if I were quantum, I could be here and in Vienna at the same time. But you don't see that in this macroscopic world, do you? You don't see you're there and I'm here. I'm not somewhere else at the same time. So I sort of use the technology as a portal to bring these effects and some other effects, traces of these effects, because you can never really see them directly. They exist in much higher dimensional spaces, which is quite magical and cool to think about higher dimensions. I use traces of these via the quantum computing in video work, in game engine situations, games or immersive environments, AR, virtual reality. There's always this digital interface that takes sort of the traces of the quantum world, this multidimensional, non-binary, maybe you could call it queer, with different temporalities, and it brings them into this work. And I've been working to develop a new aesthetic based on these things.
So to maybe explain the concept of binary in layman's terms, the way I understand is that the way we perceive reality mostly is something is true or something is not true. Let's say, and I think you gave also the example of the famous example of Schrödinger's cat. There's a cat in a box, you don't know if it's dead or not. The moment you open the box, it's either alive or dead, but it's one of those two things. When you apply quantum theory to that, the cat can be both alive and dead at the same time. I mean, that's a complicated concept to understand for most people, because the way we perceive the world is it's either this or that. So how do you deal with that complexity?
I love it. I'm happy to sit in the unknowability of it all. Like we said at the start, quantum theory has been tested in experiments for the last 100 years and never been falsified. So while so cats are macroscopic, so there's probably they don't exist in what's known as a superposition of dead and alive. But things at the microscopic level do this. And actually you can create, what I've been working with is like not just two possibilities, but whole stacks of possibilities existing with the same material in the same location at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it'd be like if I'm here, there, all at once, but it's just one of me, it's not copies. And that gets translated into a layered, blurry, shape-shifting aesthetic in my video works,
I want to go into a specific work you've worked on.
Let's make it tangible.
Let's make it tangible. So the first one I wanted to discuss is a work from 2024, I think, called Heartbreak and Magic. If it's okay, because I feel like it might be your most personal or one of your most personal works. Where, maybe you tell us about the work in the first place and then we continue from there.
It's really interesting work because it's in virtual reality, and I think what I've been really reflecting on recently is how to experience it, you really need to be in the VR. A walkthrough on the screen never captures it, but Shall I tell you the story of how it was
please,
made?
yes.
So HTC Vive Arts approached me to make a VR work, and I thought I was going to make a work on sort of entanglements to nature and so on, which is really important. But I wanted to approach it through my body first, and I do that with a lot of my practice. It comes from within rather than from within the head, which is a very Western sort of scientific way of thinking, whereas this is more intuitive. So I was working with a movement practitioner, Naomi Anand, working with a phenomenon called interoception, sensing of your internal world. So it wasn't like yoga, but it was like working with pressure and movement and breath with your body, but in a very slow way, sort of bringing your imagination inside. And afterwards I would go home and they're actually just right behind you, make all of these sort of drawings and paintings automatically. And what came out is that I was holding a lot of grief in my belly because my sister died in 2019, my sister Sally, by suicide, which is obviously absolutely horrific. And when she passed, I'm not religious, so I sort of, when you're struggling with grief, I mean, I'm still struggling with it to some extent now, but when you're really in the midst of it after it happens, you're trying to answer these unknowable questions, like where could she be? First of all, why did she do that? All of these sort of more practical questions, but now she's dead, could she exist somewhere? There was these coincidences where she might visit me as a butterfly, or in my sleep she would grab me and I'd wake up and I'd be like, oh my God, my sister was just there. Like, what is that? Is it just my brain searching, or is it something more? So in those crazy, horrible days, I was like turning to quantum physics as almost like a religion, like, because the mathematics that I used when I was a scientist really does predict, say, the multiverse, which is like all the different parallel worlds existing at the same time. So sometimes I'd imagine us still existing, still being somewhere in a different realm. And obviously, like, my scientific brain is like, no, that's not true. But then, like, my spirit and my heart is like, yeah. So Vive Arts were amazing because they let me kind of take them on this journey from what I proposed into like a work about grief and magic and hope. And then I used quantum computing to animate lots of elements in the virtual world. So it's a virtual reality work that takes you through kind of these themes, but it's very abstracted, it's very visceral. This is what I mean by saying you need to be in the work to really feel it, because to see it doesn't, when you're at a distance from it, you don't get the same response. But when it was exhibited, people, not everyone, but certain people would come out crying, or really, like, it really moved people. Some people said it really helped them to see into themselves or imagine other possibilities. So it's quite transformational in that way, I think.
It also really spoke to me because I know you and your work for a while, and from the outside, just by perceiving art and quantum, you think in this scientific context at first. You don't think about emotions or feelings in that context. So I liked, when I discovered that work, I liked how you also framed the concept of quantum feeling.
Yeah.
What that is, because that's so opposed to like the rational idea of physics, scientists, and so on. So I find it quite fascinating.
Yeah. So it's a quantum feeling, and just like I'm always thinking about the quantum physics is essentially unknowable. There's models, mathematical models that approach the unknown, but what is it really? What is happening? We haven't got access to the real, or I call it the unreal. We don't know. So how much can we imagine, especially not to gatekeep, but especially if you haven't been trained in the mathematics and we're using this language that represents a binary world, like this macroscopic world. And then, so I really think quantum feeling and sitting with the contradictory elements of quantum and the multiplicities and the paradox helps us to experience the magic and the potential of it in different ways. And also we, as feeling beings, I'm quite an emotional person, I'm very sensitive. And quite often, like, I can feel, if I sit with myself and focus, I can really feel different emotions simultaneously, like sadness and happiness and joy, and they can all exist at once. So it's kind of about experience on ourselves in a deeper complexity as well, rather than flattening ourselves to these robots on phones and that type of thing.
I would also interpret it that way, that in my understanding, the Newtonian way of looking at the world in this rational dualist way, of course, has many advantages and explains a lot of phenomena in a very rational way. But often when we feel other things that we can't explain through that, feelings, observations that we can only explain with words like magic, or things are spiritual, or things are esoteric, these fields, I think, emerged because we couldn't explain things in any other way. So would you say that with quantum, that quantum is a way of understanding the world that incorporates maybe spiritual elements or magical elements, as the classical theories don't?
Yeah, the classical theories definitely don't. So when I was a scientist, we used to get scientists are quite protective about what is sort of tested and known, and what is kind of woo-woo or a grounded hypothesis. So they sort of they love to categorize, and I experienced that myself because I was like that. Now, it's not to say what happens on YouTube in particular is people say, there's a lot of like hippie spiritual people who say quantum is everywhere, and that means we can manifest, and if we think hard enough we can manifest a perfect guy or a dream house or whatever. And I don't believe it's that either. But what it teaches you, I'm somewhere in the middle between these 2 points, and it's a blurry middle, a multidimensional middle, is there's a lot of things we don't understand and know about reality and the universe and ourselves and consciousness. And to close things down because they cannot be, or say it's impossible because they can't be measured using a Western reductive scientific method, I think that's stupid. So it's not that you necessarily need to invoke quantum to explain in certain things, but there is a lot we don't know, and I think sitting in that unknowability or the unknown is really productive. And so maybe I always think when quantum technologies are further developed, maybe we'll have a quantum computer vision where we start to look at the world with genuine quantum eyes. So they are non-local, meaning things can affect each other non-causally across space and time, and with a plural lens, a non-binary lens, and maybe we'll start to see things that we could never imagine, like Copernicus revolution, but in a different way.
And do we need quantum computing for that? Yes.
We need to be, I would say we need quantum technologies for that. It might not, quantum computing is what everyone focuses on, right?
Right, yeah.
But there's like a whole zoo of other technologies that are based on the quantum materiality, yeah.
I want to go to the next piece of work, where I think there is an interesting connection because it's Shadowscapes.
My show
which was just very recent in London at Orleans.
It's still on, yeah.
It's still on.
Yeah.
And, checking out, I think there's a lot to say about that exhibition. But I think where for me the connection between Heartbreak and Magic and Shadowscapes is that I read this text that you wrote that was very personal, I think, on a website connected to it, which was, I think, about your sister, but also about your upbringing and your family. And again, I felt like, wow, is it such an interesting, such a wide scope of looking at your art practice between your personal story and the quantum side of it. So maybe you can expand on that.
Yeah, so Shadowscapes, shall I say something about the exhibition first?
Yeah,
and what
please.
the works
Yes.
are, and then
I always jump to it.
And then we can talk about it.
Yeah.
No, there's so much in there. So it's an exhibition at Orleans House Gallery. It's on till 1st of March, so please go if you're in London, West London. It's very beautiful there. It's by the river in West London. And I was approached over a year ago because they wanted contemporary artists working with technology to work with some Turner paintings, you know, the famous British painter.
Turner Prize.
Turner Prize, yeah.
Turner paintings, yes.
Yeah, so I chose 3 Turner paintings from the Tate, first of all, and we loaned those there in the show. They're lesser known ones, and I was working with one of the Tate curators, Nicole, quite closely, and I chose paintings that resonated with me emotionally, that had light and dark, that spoke to kind of psychology, but also had the human figure blended with nature or technology and so in them. And the concept that I was working through was Jung's concept of shadow. So I'm sure most people know what this is, but it's the sort of the parts of ourselves that we deem unacceptable. So therefore, subconsciously, or all of it subconsciously, we suppress it. And everyone's got a shadow side. So if you think you don't, that means you're probably suppressing yours even more. And what Jung talks about, or people, it's on TikTok as well these days, is that you can do shadow work to integrate your shadow, etc. But because I had like a tricky upbringing and I've had to do a lot of work in therapy over many years, decades, like I think I know a bit about my own shadow and I'm interested in exploring it even more, which I did through the process of working with the Turners and through different methods, using them as like almost like portals and the imagery to sort of conjure up the darkness and dark and light within me in different ways. But also shadow is important because as we're seeing in the world at the moment, there's a lot of polarization, right? Right versus left, humans above nature. But when we don't integrate our shadow, we can project it onto others, other people, other groups, like we're seeing in the UK quite a lot right now, and nature as well. We sort of dominate over, we see ourselves as under control, or we don't have these wild sort of shadowy parts of, we're not part of nature, but actually we are as well. So the works in the show explore these through watercolour paintings. There's a generative sound piece, and then there's a visual piece that's interactive that I made using the game engine and quantum computing and AI. Yeah, and the sound piece uses quantum computing as well. Yeah, everything gets like entangled together.
Yeah, it was also participatory in some way, right? So how could viewers of the exhibition participate in maybe discovering their own shadow in some way?
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, first of all, hopefully just contemplation in the space helps people to reflect on their own shadow. Because when I'm vulnerable, it's not explicit, I'm not being didactic about my shadow, but you know, there's certain imagery and emotional aspects of the work that might trigger something for people to think about themselves. But in terms of like the literal interaction with the visual work, it's a big projected work. And when you sit in front of it, at first, if you're looking at it from a distance, so elsewhere in the gallery space, it's moving at kind of a fast pace. There's lots of imagery related to the Turner paintings, but also related to my automatic drawing and writing practices, which ground everything. And there's a soundtrack as well, which is quite emotional. But when you sit on this beanbag in front of it, the work slows right down. So the speed of the videos and the images and the sound, everything drops. And it becomes more like a painting, and you see yourself through a webcam in the work. So you're part of this sort of tumultuous landscape, or maybe a bit, because I was also working with golden shadow as well, which is more positive. I guess they're blurry, but... And then there's a spoken narrative that starts to play then, that perhaps invites you to see yourself and think more of yourself in that space. So it's seeing yourself gazing back out of this shadowy landscape, but not literally. You do see yourself, but it's not super literally. There's like you're almost like a ghost. You're there and not there, and everything's still shifting a little bit. It's not fixed. Yeah.
You mentioned the post-anthropocentric world as probably a perspective that's much needed nowadays. Also when it comes to, I think you've also done work related to climate change and the planet, which is obviously, you also mentioned before, the human-centeredness or the human idea of being above nature. So in what way do you feel your work or quantum thinking, quantum feeling can help us move beyond this anthropocentric idea of humans ruling over the world and controlling and dominating in some way?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think in many ways, but I guess my work doesn't lecture, it's not telling you, it's sort of perhaps showing you, and it depends on how people look, right? And also, I see humans as part of nature in a horizontal way, not above, but also maybe not below as well, because people often talk about more than human, but I see it's like, it's a horizontal web. And quantum, because of the non-binary nature of quantum and that many different possibilities or all possibilities can exist at once, kind of in a non-hierarchical way, in an entangled way, deeply entangled. So entangled that there's no way of getting an individual out at all. More so than, like, say, the bacteria in our gut. It's a much stronger symbiosis than we can ever imagine, really. And these concepts help us think about ourselves as part of nature. And I think the way, for me at least, to approach that, I approach it in a number of ways in my work. As a sort of physical materiality, I use slime a lot.
Yes, I wanted to get into that as well. So tell us more about slime, and I love the word as well, ooze.
Oh, ooze. Auf Deutsch, was ist ooze?
Was ist ooze? I have to think. It's slime is Schleim.
Schleim, yeah, I love that in German, yeah.
And ooze
Schleim.
is probably I can't even say. Yeah. I don't even know if there's an appropriate translation of ooze.
Maybe you
German.
just use the English word.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ooze. Yeah, or in English, mucus is quite a nice one as well, yeah. So, like, again, we forget that we are a part of nature, right? But if you put your tongue inside your cheek, and we start to feel our slimy self, right? And then all of our orifices are slimy. So there's no, like, maybe we don't call it slime, but there's like a mucus or a viscous gel or, snot or wax, or there's something that protects us or allows certain things through and repels other things. So all of our orifices are slimy, and our vagina or elsewhere, everywhere. And I think there's no multicellular life form without some sort of slime or gel or whatever at its core. So it's sort of this connecting substance through all of life. But it also speaks of quantum particles, which become fluid. There's no sort of solid structure at the microscopic level. I also talk about the slimy world of Big Tech, but that's probably it.
We can also go into that.
Yeah.
I'm curious, like the reason why you use slime and ooze and similar materials is because these materials open up more multiverse ways of expressing yourself, or of almost like translating maybe some of these quantum ideas into our binary reality. Because I think you also talk about the translation process and the difficulty of representation, because we live in this 3D world that is binary in many ways, at least how we perceive it today. So there's always, from these quantum theories, there's always an act of translation, because we can't otherwise talk about it. So is slime and ooze a way of translating this into something we know, but at the same time opens up?
Yeah, the quantum world isn't slimy. It's something beyond. We can't, even I can't even imagine what's actually there. But I love it because slime is really repulsive, and it breaks down binaries, right? It's repulsive. I'll give you some slime, you're like, oh, but also there's a seductive nature about it. It is slippery, it's uncontainable, it's boundaryless, it's neither a solid nor a liquid. It, like, occupies liminal spaces. Is it alive? Is it dead? It talks about health, disgust, othering, or you're a bit slimy people. There's a lot to unpack there. I've done it in multiple works since 22, like slime core, slime crawl. I'm sure I've got some other slimy works as well. But I think when I use quantum computing as well, when I use sort of the non-binary nature from Superposition to say, for instance, generatively edit video, what you're seeing is literally multiple different temporalities all existing at once. So some artists quite often talk about that and tell you about nonlinear time and nonlinear temporalities, but what you're seeing is actually the materiality of that acting through using quantum computing. And you always get this sort of blurry, almost fluid-like nature to that, because there's multiple different videos all playing at once, and this huge sort of multiverse of different viewpoints, alternative perspectives all at once. And the aesthetic is a bit watery, it is a bit fluid, it is a bit slimy, even if it's not literal slime I'm working with. So it's something about dissolving and breaking down sort of the existing categories and hierarchies. So back to like the things that are anthropocentric, sort of resisting those and going into a space of something beyond. Yeah.
You mentioned before the tech world. Slimy or
slimy big tech.
Slimy big tech. And maybe we can go into that a little bit more, because
you're funded by Vienna Business. They want you to go into that.
I mean, I'm curious what you think, because I think you mentioned before that using quantum as a framework can also open up, new possibilities, new opportunities to move beyond this world that we live in today, which is so dominated by tech narratives and tech logics, that a lot of people, or a lot of culture, the flattening of culture that we discussed before, is basically can also be described as like making copies of not being very original or like boundary dissolving, but actually just like replicating what's been there. So how could, in that sense, how could quantum open up new possibilities to go beyond that?
I think I think it does in multiple ways. I'm trying to think the best way to. I've got a lot to say on this, the best way to describe it, but I think I always talk about the double edge of quantum computing. How on one hand there's this radical potential that we're sort of discussing, but on the other hand they are a weapon, etc., and they can replicate and copy and extend exponentially, as you already said at the start, the existing and so on in different ways. So depending on who produces tools for artists, I saw one that was published recently on a scientific website where a company had made like a quantum brush for artists, and it was just we've copied a Mondrian or Matisse maybe. It's like, why do we need quantum for that? We can already make copies. So if the right tools are developed, I think it can really help us to sort of dissolve and move into something that's more shape-shifting and co-constitutive, probably always coupled with some sort of virtual environment, because you always need that interface to bring quantum back into this reality. But the tools, as quantum computing develops, will start to get closer to this, what it really is, this quantum materiality with its entanglements and superposition. And for instance, you can't copy in the quantum world, that's impossible. So it's almost like you've got infinite originals that are combining and morphing and changing in different ways. And I think this opens up questions around, everything. I mean, capitalism is based on copies. Accounting is copying and keeping track of.
So we can finally move beyond capitalism, maybe.
Oh, come and see me in another reality, right? I think there's quantum gives us hints of how, the fundamental physics gives us hints of how we can move beyond capitalism. But big tech own the tools, and if their past history and ethics are anything to go by, we know they're going to be used for profit, control and military. Unless big tech change and the environment that they operate in changes, I don't think we literally will move beyond capitalism. But I think artists can propose using quantum, I would say feeling, not thinking, and tools in inventive, magical ways, then I think we can sort of show where the cracks are, and perhaps I don't know. I don't have all the answers.
You don't have to have them.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking. There's a very cliche quote, which I think probably it's been attributed, I think, to John Lennon, but that's just the internet. Maybe it was someone else. It says, "If you can't imagine it, you can do it." I'm not sure that always holds true, but I feel like, to me, my understanding of quantum is now moving in a direction where I feel like it is a very useful tool to imagine alternative futures. And just the imagination might open up new ways of bringing them back to reality, whether quantum computing happens or not, or quantum in general happens or not, might not be that important. Once we, open up the portals to something else, we might find other ways of bringing it back into this reality.
I love that. Yeah. No, I do. I think artists or creatives of all, musicians or literature does it very well. Films. I think it does, just this, just butting up against all these unknowable areas. I mean, that's what religion is all about, right? What happens after we die, and what happens to our spirits, and how do they affect us in this reality, and we have to appease them or whatever. Think about how creative religion has been over millennia. So I guess quantum is similar to that. It's like when we hit the limits of our knowledge, that's when imagination, as you say, flourishes. But I think also imagination is still quite in our brain. Maybe there's something more about dropping into our bodies as well. So it's less dualist, in our heads, but to feel things, and I think that is really important at the moment as well. Yeah. So.
Do you see that more artists are embracing quantum?
Yeah. I think it's interesting for artists. What I've been trying to do on my Instagram, and I don't know, I'm happy to be criticised for it, but a lot of artists encounter quantum and they sort of, bring it back to this binary reality. So I was at a Sonar festival, and I was doing this private corporate talk, and someone was saying quantum helps us, not an artist by the way, helps us to think about diversity in companies, because it helps us think about multiple different voices. And obviously I'm not going to call them up and say it's not quantum, but it's not quantum because you can already think of that.
Yeah, I see.
You don't need to invoke quantum to think of multiple different voices. You should be doing it already. I'm all for diversity, that should be happening. So how can we push the imaginaries further away from those first steps into something more magical? So I talk a lot about that to try and open that up. What was the question?
If more artists are embracing quantum.
Oh yeah. I just think keep pushing beyond the first steps and into something more beyond. Go wild.
Yeah, I read this idea of the grammar. I like the idea of grammar, of establishing a grammar for artists using quantum, or for maybe beyond artists, people using quantum. Would you say that might be part of your practice of establishing a grammar of how quantum can be introduced in the arts or in the creative process?
I have my own ways, right?
Yeah.
But then I feel like it's quantum, so there should be multiple ways of using it. But I guess one thing I would say is if it looks like this reality, if it's an artwork or a process that is very, if I've made just to be really simplistic, image of a house, then it's, even if I use quantum computing to get there, is it really quantum or not? Because it's just what we have already. So where is the sort of, because quantum is a break, there's a discontinuity from this context, from this environment. So how can that be expressed through the process or the outcome of an artwork or a sound piece? And I guess there's not one way of doing that, but it's kind of like encouraging people to keep pushing into this unknowability. Because,
learning how to live with the unknown.
And unknown unknowns.
The unknown unknowns, yeah.
But I don't think that my way is the grammar. I think there should be grammars.
Yeah.
And I think different people all around the world in different locations and genders and so on will have their own approaches, which is really important. Yeah.
Maybe to finish up the conversation, I think what I love about your practice is that I feel like you explore a lot of different fields. You don't limit yourself to like one way of expressing yourselves. I feel like you take it and you develop personally along with your work. So I'm curious, what is it that you're currently working on or interested in exploring? Is it something that the world hasn't seen before through your work?
Yeah, oh my gosh, let me tell you what I've been doing. So I just got back from Norwich yesterday, and I'm working with the Sainsbury's Centre, which is quite a big art museum in Norwich. They have a wonderful collection. I think it's about 5,000 works that span the globe and span history, like span millennia, that were collected by the Sainsbury's family before being gifted to the university.
The Sainsbury's supermarket family.
I think they're connected.
Okay.
Yeah. It's housed in this huge Norman Foster building from before he was even famous. So it's quite a remarkable space. But they treat their collection like it's living. So each of the artworks or the objects, they consider them to be animate, which is interesting for me, right? And so they've commissioned me for a new work that will be ready next year for their forthcoming Meaning of Life season. So I'm laughing because obviously the meaning of life is so like, it's such a big question, like what is the meaning of life? We can't answer it, but it's also so perfect for me because it's really like unknowable. So I'm approaching it through the lens of quantum physics, but thinking about it through emotions, through love and grief, and both the subjective, my experience with the meaning of life when my sister Sally died, but also speaking to and working with a few artworks in their collection because they're alive. So perhaps they can tell me their meaning of life. So yesterday I spent a wonderful hour with a sculpture by the French-German surrealist Jean Hans Arp. There's this gold, bronze, small sort of sculpture which looks a bit like a curved tentacle, which is very, very me. And I just sat with it and held it and touched it and hugged it for about an hour with my eyes closed, and it was talking to, I mean, in my mind's eye, I was sort of hanging out with it and getting to know it. So that's the process that I'm going to be repeating a lot with these works, and then I'm going to be making artwork based on
Beautiful.
these things, yes.
So eventually you would move into performance even.
Oh my God, I've been doing some performance. No, I have done some performance. Yeah, it always scares me.
I'd love to watch you hug a sculpture for an hour.
Oh yeah, that would be sick actually. Yeah, no, but other performances I've done aren't like that. That's much easier. It's a really beautiful sculpture when you get to know something when you touch it in a very different way to than if you're just looking at it.
Well, it's ended at that. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.